again, and thanks for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 7th of August. I'm Andrew Wilson, and welcome to the Full Scottish. This afternoon, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 165 of the illegal Russian war of aggression. Then I will introduce our guests for this afternoon, and then together we will look in a little more depth at the past week's key headlines from Scotland and around the world. The UN nuclear watchdog has called for an immediate end to all military action near Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant after it was hit by shelling, causing one of the reactors to shut down and creating a very real risk of a nuclear disaster. UK intelligence warned that Russia is amassing troops in the south of Ukraine, but the purpose of the build-up is not yet clear. The Barbados-flagged general cargo ship Fulmar S became the first foreign flag ship to arrive in Ukraine since the war started in February. The ship docked in the port of Chornomorsk to be loaded with grain yesterday. Horrific video and photos appear to show a fresh atrocity with the remains of a Ukrainian prisoner of war stuck on a pole outside a house in the eastern Ukrainian city of Popasna, which was captured by Russian forces in May and is close to the current front line in the Donbass. The head of Amnesty International's Ukraine office, Oksana Pokalchuk, has quit the organisation after an Amnesty report accused Ukraine's armed forces of endangering civilians by basing troops in residential areas. Ms. Pokalchuk said that the Amnesty report sounded like support for Russian narratives of the invasion. Dozens of Ukrainian soldiers have been burned to death inside a Russian detention centre outside Donetsk, while many others face torture under a regime of absolute evil, according to a former prisoner, Anna Vorosheva, who was captured while delivering aid to Mariupol. A European Union plan to cut gas use and help Germany wean itself off dependency on Russia will come into effect early next week. Last week, EU member states agreed to reduce their gas use by 15% over the winter, with exceptions for some countries and despite opposition from Hungary. Vitaly Gur, an official with the Russian occupying authorities in Kherson, was gravely wounded on Saturday in an attempted assassination, local Moscow-backed officials said. And Meta, formerly named Facebook, has removed 45 Facebook accounts and 1,037 Instagram accounts operated by a troll farm in St. Petersburg, Russia. Now, this afternoon, we're lucky enough to be joined by two fantastic guests. Firstly, Maureen Watt is a retired politician and former Minister for Mental Health in the Scottish Government. Maureen was the member of the Scottish Parliament representing Aberdeen South and North Kincardine from 2011 to 2021 when she retired, having previously served as a regional member for the North East of Scotland from 2006 until 2011. Maureen, good afternoon. Fit like?
Nae bad, who's yourself? A fine sunny day here. What's it like with you?
Doing away here too. Thanks, Maureen. And we're also lucky enough to be joined today by Richard Lewis. Richard is a musician and writer and a former SNP councillor for Collington and Fairmile Head in Edinburgh. This August, Richard is producing and performing a cabaret-style one-man celebration on the Festival Fringe at Lower Hall St Stephen's Theatre, which is called Hamlet After Party. Richard, good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon. Very well. Lovely to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us on the Full Scottish today, Richard. Now, our first story this afternoon is that Israel has warned that its campaign against Islamic Jihad could last a week, and its attacks on Gaza have destroyed apartment buildings and struck refugee camps. At least 4 children were killed in a blast close to the Jabalia refugee camp on Saturday, according to Hamas, the group that governs the Gaza Strip. It blamed Israel for the deaths, but the Israeli military denied responsibility, saying that the explosion was caused by a failed rocket launched by Islamic Jihad. The latest deaths bring the tally of children killed since Friday to 6, and the total death toll amongst Palestinians to 29. At least 250 others have also been wounded, according to the Ministry of Health in Gaza. The violence has raised fears of another war on Gaza by Israel just 15 months after a month-long conflict killed more than 260 people. About 2.3 million Palestinians are packed into the narrow coastal Gaza Strip, with Israel and Egypt tightly restricting the movement of people and goods in and out of the enclave and imposing a naval blockade, citing security concerns. Israel stopped the planned transport of fuel into Gaza shortly before the attack started on Friday, crippling the territory's only power plant and reducing electricity to about 4 hours a day, and drawing warnings from health officials that hospitals would be severely affected within days. This latest violence, poses an early test for the current Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid, who assumed the role of caretaker leader ahead of elections in November when he hopes to keep the top job. Lapid is a centrist former TV host but who also has experience in diplomacy, having served as foreign minister in the outgoing government. But he is not so much in the way of security credentials. A conflict with Gaza could burnish his standing and give him a boost as he faces off against the former Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's more of a security hawk and who led Israel during 3 of its 4 wars with Hamas. So, Maureen, firstly, what do you think is at the root of this latest escalation of the violence on the Gaza Strip? Is it a simple wish to punish Palestinians, or is it exploiting cover with the cover of the conflict in Ukraine, or is it all about domestic Israeli politics?
Well, my heart sinks every time I hear of more deaths in Palestine. And it seems to me that while Hamas are the so-called government there, that the Palestine Islamic Jihad are certainly gaining ground there, and they are backed by Iran and Syria. So I can see from Israel's point of view that they think that things might be escalating against them, and maybe this is them trying to prevent something like that. But as you say, Palestine falls off the agenda quickly falls off the agenda when other things are seen to be more prominent, and clearly international players are not paying much attention to this ongoing conflict in the Middle East, which never ever seems to be anywhere near resolution.
Thanks, Maureen. That's a point you make very well indeed. And Richard, I was going to ask you a broader question. Do you think, is it going to be widely accepted that children are the collateral damage when you use missiles to try to execute individual targets in heavily populated, densely populated urban environments? And at the same time, should steps begin to be taken to make that sort of conflict, that sort of behaviour more clearly unacceptable?
Well, I mean, obviously the second part of your question is sort of goes without saying, really. That, obviously the focus in any international negotiation, one would hope, would be to reduce, collateral casualties. But to a certain extent, it's become so normalised now in Israel and Palestine over the last 10 years, and certainly over the last 5 years in the Trump administration particularly, where effectively the two-state solution disappeared. And of course, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital, which is something previous administrations had always failed to do, and made the point that it was still the promise of returning to the pre-67 borders. That effectively is dead. The question is, will there be an alternative solution going forward? I mean, everyone still talks about the two-state solution, but in effect, with the increase of settlements and the action on the ground has effectively made it untenable. So, and as Maureen and yourself have both suggested, other events in the South China Sea, Taiwan, and Ukraine means that yes, if you're going to get engaged in any domestic, shall we say, cleansing policies, which looks as though what's happening in Gaza at the moment, this is a pretty good time to do it because everyone else is distracted. So yeah, that's your central focus about children. I mean, in war, collateral damage is always tragically inevitable. The broader question is, how many years are we going to be having the same conversation about the situation in the Middle East? I mean, it's been all of my life. It's been since certainly the '67 war, and we've really not gone any further. and until that's addressed, it's likely to the situation on the ground is going to get worse. I mean, for the first time now, there's direct communication between sort of Israel and Arab states. It wasn't before that. So action is happening on the ground now, regardless of what politicians outside the Middle East are saying. And it looks to me like, unfortunately, like the two-state solution is simply not going to be viable going forward. And where does that leave us? I think that's the question.
Thanks, Richard. And yes, both leaving us and the people who are living in the Gaza Strip as well at the moment. You're absolutely right. Now, for our next item, let's come back to the UK, because the upheaval and delay in departments across Whitehall as the country is forecast to slide into one of its worst economic crises, has shown that civil servants are having to contend with mass ministerial resignations, a lame duck prime minister, and a protracted Tory leadership campaign. An analysis reveals that in more than half of the UK government's key departments, ministerial announcements have been pulled at short notice, legislation has stalled, and deadlines have been missed on the publication of policy documents. One of those was the white paper with proposals to reform gambling laws. It was due this summer and has now been postponed. The charity Gambling with Lives, which supports and campaigns families affected by gambling-related suicide, has warned that tens of thousands of people will be harmed and some will die. New legislation for an online safety bill to protect children has also been paused until a new government is in place. The bill's aims are to prevent the spread of illegal content, including images of child abuse, terrorist material, and hate crimes. The NSPCC said that there can be no more important mission for government than to keep children safe from abuse, and the next Prime Minister, whoever that is, must deliver on the online safety bill as a national priority. And at the Home Office, a review by the William Shawcross of the Prevent scheme, which aims to stop people being drawn into terrorism, has still not been published, despite the terms of reference stating it would be submitted to Parliament by the 31st of December 2021. It's believed that the review was submitted to the Home Office at least 12 weeks ago. Meanwhile, a British government spokesperson said it should be judged on its actions delivering for the British people. The Prime Minister remains focused, he said, on driving forward his commitments to the British public. So, Maureen, firstly, are we all destined to continue to suffer as this zombie government stands in the corner doing nothing?
That's what it looks like, Andrew, with the PM and the Chancellor both on holiday, and it would appear there are edicts around for no ministers to say anything or do anything. We really have, at the moment, a government in abeyance at a time of huge crises where all ministers should be asking their civil servants and departments to come up with what they think that their particular department can do to help alleviate the crisis facing the poorest in our society. I mean, I heard this morning that there are people whose income won't even cover the bills that they've got, never mind food. So this is a crisis of the UK government's own making. I saw on Twitter, I think, a few hours ago, a comparison between the UK and Ireland, and their inflation rate is much, much lower than ours, and they have reserves growing instead of the UK government continually in debt. So it is a man-made situation by the UK government, and the sooner people throughout the UK, but particularly in Scotland with a referendum next year, realise that, the better.
Thanks, Maureen. And Richard, there's a line of thinking that throughout the Johnson administration and arguably the previous administration, that every single thing that this Westminster government touches turns into a crisis. Everything. The NHS in England, transport, the economy, the cost of living crisis, energy prices, the green agenda, everything they touch is a crisis. Taking the alternative perspective, are we perhaps better that this government is now doing nothing, it's not touching anything, and as a result, it won't turn more things into crises?
Well, of course, there's that argument, isn't it? They make that in Belgium, of course, which went a period, I think, of 18 months without a government, and civil servants just got on and ran things relatively effectively. So perhaps certainly there is an argument there for just, once the politicians are out the way, things may actually improve. But I think on the broader point, you're absolutely right. This was a government, after all, which largely won the election, certainly in terms of the Westminster system, by its simple and slightly facile promise of getting Brexit done, whatever the cost. And they achieved that, and to a certain extent amongst their hardcore supporters, because of course all they need to do is get their 40% of support in the Westminster system. They are relatively satisfied. They've got the hard border that they wanted, and they're in a position to blame anything else that they like on the war in the Ukraine or external circumstances, not because of their own decisions. So it's a perfect situation for those who don't want to examine actually what has been happening and their own contribution to that. It's a perfect situation for them just to stick their fingers in their ears and pretend it's nothing to do with them.
A very good point that you make there, Richard. Absolutely. Now, Maureen, perhaps the only Tory activity we're seeing at the moment is, of course, the car crash of the Titans leadership election. So I was wondering, what's your view? How do you think the messaging that we're seeing from both candidates, Truss and Sunak, regarding the democratic rights of voters in Scotland, how do you think that messaging is being received by voters in Scotland at the moment?
Well, it's interesting. I was out on doorsteps on Thursday, and people just really had their head in their hands and saying it couldn't possibly be any worse. Some people are obviously worried that could an independent Scotland do a better job in this current crisis. But my answer is you just have to look just even across to France, where, we've talked before about the 4% price cap on energy and the French government taking a larger stake in the main electricity company, EDF. So there are measures that can be taken. And Richard, said that, countries can survive with civil servants, but civil servants can only continue taking steps on the policies that are already in place. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, nothing can be done to introduce new measures to help with the health crisis in Northern Ireland. So new policies can't be put in place to deal with the new circumstances. And that's the problem that they're having in the UK at the moment. And, as far as the leadership contest goes, if it doesn't swing more and more people towards supporting independence next October, I don't know what will.
Thanks, Maureen. And Richard, both in terms of the messaging and more widely, how do you think, and what's your response to the messaging we've been seeing from both Truss and Sunak regarding Indy Ref 2 in Scotland, and how do you think also, or alternatively, those two candidates, how are they going down amongst voters in Scotland?
Well, of course, it's a slightly farcical endeavour in itself, isn't it? Because, of course, their audience is only the members of the Conservative Party. So, we're the dubious beneficiaries of their endless debates on television. The only people who actually decide it in the end are the limited members of the Tory Party, of whom I think only less than 10,000 reside north of the border. So, of course, the simple answer is they don't have to worry about messaging, because we're not going to have the slightest influence on who becomes the next Prime Minister anyway. So it seems quite clear that their strategy, if you can call it that at the moment, is to play as hard right to the older and largely white and Brexit-oriented Conservative Party as exists south of the border. And then once they've secured their Prime Ministership status, then I dare say they'll come north of the border and start trying to sweeten up to the people of Scotland again. I can kind of see that's their strategy. How it's actually going to work long term is a tricky question, but after all, this is a government who can just keep repeating the same mantras. We had the election in 2014, that's it, done and dusted for a generation. And we have a majority at Westminster, and actually, unless those north of the border and all of us are prepared to up the ante, and I do mean some sort of civil disobedience or refusal to pay taxation, or actually force them to make some sort of move, Why should they do any differently? I mean, independence movements. I mean, show me how many independence movements have been won by people staying peacefully at home historically. I would suggest there aren't many. And while Scots continue to stay at home, and whilst we don't start to say there have got to be certain points that we can make, a refusal of taxation, for example, a national campaign to say enough is enough. If we simply sit there and are prepared to take any decisions which come from an unelected government, we shouldn't be treated any differently.
That's a very
I
good
mean,
point.
I asked you again, show me a single independence movement who has won their independence of the country by staying at home. You won't find one historically. You know.
Well, exactly. I'm reminded of the independence movements in the Baltic states, who were the move to independence was peaceful, but people still had to get out and make their views clear. So your point's very well made. But Maureen, you touched on the cost of living crisis in your answer there, and so let's look at that now, because the cost of living crisis is hitting millions of households and is about to get a whole lot worse. Gas is the bedrock of power generation in the UK, supplying millions of homes directly and accounting for about 45% of the electricity supply. It has rocketed in price, up 400% in the past year and up 1,000% since 2019, according to the ICE futures market. The prospect of a tripling energy price cap in October to £3,600, that's from £1,200 in 2019, lies behind the Bank of England's warning of a long recession from this autumn, characterised by soaring inflation, falling living standards and rising unemployment. The central bank's response is to raise interest rates to bring down inflation. Liz Truss, ahead in the race to be Tory leader and Prime Minister, has a remedy, she says, wide-ranging tax cuts. Labour would provide targeted support to those struggling with most of their bills, coupled with a measure to increase investment. Now, Maureen, you said that we were seeing efforts taken in France, but it crossed my mind that there are perhaps four things readily that cross my mind. Firstly, what if the regulator Ofgem said that bills are not going up in October? About half of the current 9.4% inflation rate is accounted for by the increase in the cost of gas. And so by capping further prices, that would take the pressure off workers who need to bargain for higher wages. And so that would in turn take the pressure off the bank, who seem to only have one technique, which is to increase interest rates. What about a bigger windfall tax? Britain produces gas and oil in the North Sea. As Chancellor, Sunak agreed to apply an extra 25% levy on the industry's windfall profits, and he said that would raise about £5 billion. But of course, he allowed firms to offset 80% of the new investment cost against tax, which means that combined with existing tax breaks, oil and gas firms get 91 pence off their corporation tax for every pound they spend on investment. And of course, there's no evidence that the windfall profits are being invested. All we're seeing are higher dividends and share buybacks. Thirdly, more generous benefits. We've got a £400 discount on bills coming in October. £650 means tested one-off payment to 8 million low-income households, and also £150 for those on disability benefits and £300 for pensioners. But that was all designed when the forecast for the October cap was £2,800, not £3,600. Bills are so high that subsidies would not be seen as inflationary. They're just keeping the wolf from the door. And then finally, what the Bank of England officials say, have said that they've increased interest rates by half a percentage point, which is the largest margin in more than 25 years. And they say they do that because they fear wage rises next year will outstrip inflation and generate a wage price spiral. But they admit there's little evidence of workers really using their muscle to secure high wage rises at the moment. And this could change if inflation remains high. To emphasise how weak pay demands have been, the latest official figures show average earnings increased by only 4% to June, and 6% if you include bonuses. The vast bulk of bonuses are paid in the financial, professional and business services industries. And so if the bank is worried by inflation, why doesn't it cap the bonuses of the city firms which the bank itself regulates? So, Maureen, that was a very long introduction. My apologies. Are there any signs of any of these four options or anything else being brought forward to stop people dying from cold and hunger in the UK this winter?
At the moment, absolutely not. As I said before, we've got a government that's in abeyance until we get a new Prime Minister almost a month from now, and every minute in this crisis counts. So, we could do all of these things, but can you see Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss doing any of these things? Quite frankly, no. And, I heard one economist say that all of these things would just be tinkering around the edges. And what we need is a complete change in our economy, and really taxing those that can afford it. So really taxing the wealthy, whether it be wealthy individuals or wealthy businesses, and start redressing the huge inequality that we have in the UK. It's one of the worst in the world. And until we tackle that, I can't see that we're ever going to get to a situation where we haven't got a huge number of people in the UK living in poverty or right on the edge. It is possible other countries like the Scandinavian countries do not have the wealth gap that we have in this country. And as you can see, it's not something that we're going to get from either of the candidates for PM. Rishi Sunak, as we know, clawed back the £20 increase that was given during COVID for universal credit. And as you say, wage rises are anywhere meeting inflation. So until we get a government that is prepared to take these bold steps, I can't see that the UK isn't going to fall further behind, increasing the wealth gap, increasing poverty, and falling down the league tables in terms of a wealthy country. So it's really a very bleak prospect. And, I've been thinking about what sort of things that the Scottish Government with limited resources can do. And I think working with local authorities, we're really going to have to start thinking about, opening public halls and sports centres for people to come for some warmth during the day and a decent meal for at least once in the day. These are kind of, warlike measures, but what else are we going to do, as you say, to prevent people dying of cold and hunger?
Thanks, Maureen. You're absolutely right. I know that Edinburgh University has already announced that it will open its main library in George Square to anybody from October, to operate as a heat bank. Richard, more broadly, thinking about the UK government approach, if that's not overstating it, why do you think the UK government is so well? Is it indolence or is it incompetence in the face of such an escalating crisis?
Yeah, I mean it's a very good question, isn't it? I think that's sort of, particularly in terms of the specific energy crisis at the moment. I mean, we've got a combination of the short term and the longer term issues, which we're neither particularly addressing. And of course, we have this immediate pressure with these rises coming on, particularly on the poorest in society, as Maureen's just rightly talked about. But simultaneously, it's enabling a lot of people to take the eye above the longer term challenges, which is, of course, to wean ourselves off carbon in the first place. These are the very companies who actually were the ones who buried information about the greenhouse effect 30 years ago and have spent hundreds of billions, literally hundreds of billions, in lobbying for politicians in every country in the world to prevent them putting any green measures in, carbon reduction, Clean Air Act. So they spent 30 years doing that. Now, the very same people are now complaining about windfall taxes, now complaining about the lack of investment in industries they know themselves are doomed if our planet is to have a future. And this is this extraordinary situation that only how many months is it after the Glasgow summit? That entire agenda, which was existential in terms of the future of this planet, has somehow been wiped clean because we're worrying about, rightly, the price of energy increases. But the planet is not going to wait around for us to get our economy in line. And we need a government who's simultaneously going to look at the short-term pressures on people's bank balances, but the longer-term pressures that we as a planet, as a universal community face. And the bottom line is that we need to start seeing these energy companies as the tobacco companies of today, as they indeed are. The tobacco companies, they literally follow the same agenda. In many cases, they had the same advisors of the tobacco companies, which was to keep the scientific evidence away from the general public, to discredit it, to lobby politicians. They followed precisely those rules over the last 30 years. There's no question about it. And yet we're still treating them, whereas you should be treating them as pariahs. And part of the problem, we're constantly being told we have to somehow woo them. It's an extraordinary state of affairs.
Absolutely, Richard, and it's going to have to change sometime soon because, as you say, we don't. Time is not on our side to address these matters. But the green agenda and tackling climate change is also one aspect of our next story this afternoon, because the U.S. Senate Democrats yesterday began a vote on a bill that would address key elements of Joe Biden's agenda, tackling climate change, lowering the cost of energy and senior citizens' drugs, and forcing the wealthy to pay more taxes. Earlier, a Senate rulemaker determined that the lion's share of the $430 billion bill could be passed with only a simple majority. That bypasses a filibuster rule requiring 60 votes in the 100-seat chamber to advance most legislation, and that means the Democrats can pass it over Republican objections. There are three main parts to the bill: a 15% minimum tax on corporations, tougher IRS enforcement, and a new excise tax on stock buybacks. The legislation has $430 billion in new spending, along with raising more than $740 billion in new revenues. Beside billions of dollars to encourage the production of more electric vehicles and foster clean energy, the bill will also set $4 billion in new federal drought relief funds. Democrats aim to push the bill through the Senate using a complicated reconciliation procedure, allowing passage without any Republican support in the chamber, which is divided 50-50 between the parties, but which the Democrats control because Kamala Harris, the vice president, can cast a tie-breaking vote. The beginning of the vote kicks off an arduous process that could extend into later today or early next week, with senators offering amendment after amendment in a time-consuming vote-a-rama. So firstly, Maureen, I'm interested in the practical politics of such wide-ranging legislation. Is this bill an attempt to, in political terms, to provide something, more or less something for everyone at the same time?
Oh, that we had some urgency here in the UK, like Biden is showing in the United States. And correct me if I'm wrong, you folks, but is it not something reminiscent of the money that Obama pumped into the economy in the 2008 crisis, worldwide crisis, and managed to get the economy back on track more quickly? Well, have we ever recovered from 2008 in the UK, to be honest? So I really hope that they manage to get it through the legislative process as quickly as possible, and hopefully, but I'm sure my hope is in vain, that the next Prime Minister of the UK sees what can be done and what should be done in order to get the economy back on track.
Thanks, Maureen. And Richard, you were talking about let's call it the malign influence of big oil and big energy in the way in which the planet's approach to the climate crisis has played out so far. In this bill, which is before the Senate, there's been compromise already in the passage of the bill getting to this stage. And I wondered, in light of what you were saying about the way in which big oil and big energy operates, do you think there's a risk that we will have to see more compromise in this bill? And indeed, is there a risk that the efforts of those organizations will mean that this bill is going to end up being gutted?
Well, of course, that's almost inevitability, and when you have very, very small or not non-existent majority. I mean, the days of the Johnson administration, of course, I'm talking about the Lyndon B. Johnson administration and all the passing of those great society bills in the 60s, and using his incredible ability at that stage to get, Democrats and Republicans to work together to pass all those groundbreaking legislation that he did in the 60s. Something notably lacking from the British Johnson administration, I think we could. Those days have become virtually impossible in the United States. So instead of passing primary legislation and creating the sorts of social security platforms that Lyndon Johnson did, they're reduced to trying to put short-term budgetary measures in place to target certain aspects of society. And as welcome, of course, as they are, once the money runs out, because they're not legislated for, those programs also die away. So it's nothing but sort of sticky plaster legislation, unfortunately, going on because of the polarization that exists in the United States. But nonetheless, it's very welcome that something is happening there. But yes, there's no getting away from the nefarious influence of the lobbying powers. I mean, in any country, but that's particularly tackling in the United States. You mentioned oil again. There is 3 oil lobbyists for every single member of Congress. That's an extraordinary statistic, which means there's something like 3,000 people purely paid to lobby for the oil and gas industry. And that's what you're up against. Yeah. These are the people who can't afford to pay for windfall tax, but can afford to deny the evidence from their own scientists. It was an employee of Texaco who was the very first person to unmask the link between carbon and the planet and the glasshouse effect. It was actually the oil companies who discovered, ironically, that the planet is under dire threat. I mean, it's just an extraordinary irony. You couldn't, if you wrote the plot, no one would ever make the film in Hollywood. It would be too unbelievable.
That's a good point that you make, Richard. I know certainly, as you say, Texaco and also the role of Exxon, which of course failed, but Exxon in terms of understanding the climate science and then suppressing it. But I was going to ask you, Maureen, does the progress with this legislation indicate that Joe Biden's historically low approval ratings will change? Does it indicate perhaps that in sharp contrast to his predecessor, Biden is more interested in delivering on his policy platform rather than focusing on approval ratings and fighting culture wars?
Yes, I think he is, and I hope he manages to continue on that, because if we have a president who's going to do the right thing by his country rather than look for approval ratings, surely that in the end you would think would mean that his approval ratings would go up. But I think in the US, as in many other countries, and particularly post-Trump, there's such a polarization of views in the US that it'll be difficult to see if there's any shift from people moving from Republican to Democrat. But I suppose we'll just have to wait and see on that. But if he can be seen to be delivering for the vast majority of citizens in the US, surely, all the lobbyists and all the far right Trump-in folk can be overcome if the right thing is done, as I say, to the US citizens by the government.
Thanks, Maureen. And Richard, in a sense, the same question. Do you think that voters in the US are going to begin to see that they have a president at the moment who is very different to his predecessor, and that perhaps if this bill can be passed and be signed by the president, that it will turn the approval ratings and turn the politics in the US more in favor of the Democrats?
Well, absolutely. One would like to think so, but Maureen makes a very valid point that the polarization level in the US is at a level that it's never been seen historically. I mean, I saw a program recently talking about the Watergate trials, the Watergate scandal and the investigation after that. Now, at that stage in the mid-70s, it was still just the ABC, NBC, and CBS, the 3 major networks, which broadly speaking covered it in exactly the same way with relatively objective feedback and analysis. And Democrats and Republicans were both fairly agreed about both the nature of the evidence and about what had to be done, etc. And hence the reason that the country actually did move on fairly successfully from Watergate. But when you have a situation now where one half of the country watches Fox TV and it has a very specific slant, and that information contrary to that slant doesn't even get aired, and the other half of the country will watch their own, either MSNBC or obviously CNN, then you've simply got 2 halves of the country living in 2 entirely different universes. And how does one therefore get a message through in that basis? So I think, there are some fairly fundamental strategic issues just in the nature of the freedom of information, and how to ensure that the public gets what can be called objective news in a situation where you have networks which are able simply to dictate both the information that gets to the audience and an audience who has no access to the other side. That's for me the worrying side, and that's a huge change from, as we say, the Watergate era, and it's often not talked about that much, but that program really brought it into contention. You know, the difference of the broadly speaking respected national networks in the 70s, and now total polarization from what people actually hear. That people literally in the same street, living next to each other, can have an entirely different understanding of the world. It's quite terrifying.
It absolutely is, and the issues underpinning that change, I think, is absolutely right. Just to tie this story off, I understand that it looks like most of the Republican amendments to the bill have been defeated in the House, and so the process of voting will continue. But let's come back to Scotland for our next item, because as we know, Scotland has the most concentrated pattern of private land ownership in the entire developed world. The degree of concentration is evident from the fact that 432 landowners account for half of all Scotland's privately owned land. Such land, since not much more than 10% of Scotland is in public ownership, accounting in turn for the bulk of the country. The inequality inherent in Scotland's land ownership pattern, however, is of an entirely different order. The disparity in this instance the disparity in this instance is not between a 100th of the population and the other 99. Setting aside complex ownership structures that many owners have put in place in order to obscure or conceal aspects of their ownership, the divide in Scotland is the equivalent of 1/12,000th part of the population and the remainder. The present concentration of ownership in Scotland yields some staggering statistics. A minuscule 0.025% of the population owns 67% of the privately owned rural land. 30 owners own more than 25,000 hectares each, whilst the largest private landowner of them all, the Duke of Buccleuch, has Scottish estates covering 124,000 hectares. Now, to tie that to another story this week, we've been discussing this week a rewilding project on a former grouse moor at Langham in southern Scotland, which has doubled in size after a roller coaster fundraising campaign by local activists. The Langham Initiative announced on Friday it's raised a further £2.2 million needed to buy another 2,500 hectares of moorland from the Duke of Buccleuch. Jenny Barlow, who is the Tarras Valley Nature Reserve's estate manager, and the Tarras Valley is the planned reserve that will be made from the land that's being bought from the Duke. She said that this is about a grassroots fight back against the climate emergency and biodiversity crisis, and helping to create a better future. She said, "We're doing something so special here, and our expanding reserve is an amazing opportunity for people to visit this part of the world and be inspired by the wonders of nature." So, Maureen, firstly, do you think should supporting grassroots fightbacks to promote community ownership and a fight back against the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis, should supporting those things be a higher priority for the Scottish Government, do you think?
Well, I can't speak for the Scottish Government, but I'm sure it is a priority if they had the funds to do it. I mean, the community land bank scheme has been very successful, and we've seen where there's been community buyouts, very successful projects taking place, and people coming back to live in the area, businesses setting up in the area, and as you said, rewilding projects, Andrew. So I'm sure the Scottish Government would like to do more. And although I haven't been following it very closely, there is a new land reform bill starting out in the Parliament, I think. How well it will tackle the huge inequality in land ownership, I don't know. I think there's always this fear among smaller landowners that they'll be affected by this. But as long as it's to the very huge land estates that are being targeted in this, then I think, we will get more progress on the bill, because it's absolutely ridiculous in the 21st century that this can happen, that foreign owners can come and buy huge estates in Scotland, and presumably the profits from them go back to their home countries, and again seeing the resources of Scotland taken away from Scotland rather than for the benefit of Scotland. So it'll be interesting to see the progress of this bill as it goes through the Scottish Parliament.
Thanks, Maureen. That's a very good point that you make. The Scottish Government started consulting during July on a consultation paper called Land Reform in a Net Zero Nation, which sets out Scottish Government proposals and seeks view on a range of land-related issues. But Richard, I was going to ask you, in the context of these community land buyouts, do you think as the cost of living crisis snowballs, are these large transfers of often public money to people who are already exceedingly wealthy, are these transfers of cash going to become more controversial?
Well, I mean, one would have thought so, just from as I said, the way you've outlined it there. I mean, I have to say, I'm not terribly familiar with the ongoing consultation into land reform at the moment. Obviously, something Maureen will be far more familiar than I am with. But I suppose that the broader question that you raised upon who owns what, and obviously it was the very famously Andy Whiteman's book on Who Owns Scotland, which went into precisely a lot of the unique aspects of Scottish land ownership and just the degree to which how few own so much. In terms of going forward and how it tags onto the green agenda, I mean, that's something obviously which I think is, I wouldn't say it's in its infancy, but it's obviously also it's also tied in with aspects of agricultural development, land use for wheat versus for cattle, for the entire move away perhaps from a much more meat-based diet that we've traditionally had towards a more mixed diet. So I understood there are a couple of competing interests. It's not that it can't be you can't, as it were, separate the ownership from these green aspects, but nonetheless that there's a number of aspects running through it. I think the only other thing I would add that whereas a number of countries, and I'm familiar having worked in Austria quite a bit, that there's a number of regulations, particularly in the area south of Bavaria, around Salzburg and those parts of Austria, which traditionally were playgrounds for wealthy Germans coming down south, and there was reform passed in Austria to prevent that sort of too many wealthy Germans coming and buying up large chunks of Austrian land and second home ownership, precisely because they were having the sorts of problems that a lot of rural areas in Scotland are having. Absentee landowners, absentee landlords, and properties that's sitting vacant for months of the year. The villages then consequently declining, the local shops closing, etc., and an increasing urbanization of the country. So undoubtedly, looking at that aspect as well is going to make a huge impact upon reviving our rural Scotland and the islands. So I'll certainly be following the consultation into this next land bill as it goes forward. It's crucially important.
Thanks,
you should
Richard.
be doing more than that, Andrew.
Yeah,
You should be doing more than that, Richard, but putting in a consultation thing saying, please look at what's happened in Austria and look at their legislation and perhaps take that on board in Scotland. But I'd also like to point out it's also urban land as well as rural that we need to be looking at, because there's huge dereliction in our cities.
No, that's a very good point, Maureen. And Richard, I was just going to say the poor had no lawyers. The Poor has had no lawyers. Who Owns Scotland and How They Got It by Andy Whiteman. It's published by Berlin Books, and I think is a tenner. I think. But Maureen, I was going to ask you briefly: should land reform be accelerated in Scotland, or can land reform be accelerated in Scotland at the same time as we're leading up to the likelihood of Indy Ref 2?
I don't see why not, because I think land reform is something that does excite in Scotland, and they see what's happening to vast tracts of our land being bought up by wealthy foreign people who want to come and live in Scotland in relative seclusion. So I think it is something that people will take on board when they're thinking about how they will vote in a referendum, because there are huge opportunities that can be had in our rural areas if the ownership of land was better distributed than it is now.
Thanks, Maureen. Now then, looking at the time, let's come back to Edinburgh for our final story this afternoon, because as the Edinburgh Fringe officially kicked off on the 5th of August, Bristol Square and George Square, two of the main festival sites, are already thronging with revellers enjoying the sunshine in the festival's outdoor bars by early afternoon, as well as, of course, scores of performers handing out flyers to promote their shows. Venues are reporting that a last-minute surge of ticket sales is bringing them close to or exceeding 2019 levels, which was the biggest ever Fringe. Ticketing had been lagging behind, but venues are hoping that a post-pandemic trend towards last-minute bookings will see them achieve the 2019 levels. Anthony Alderson, who's the director of the Pleasance, said that he had seen a fantastic bump in sales over the past week. The huge spike is exactly what we needed to show there is confidence in this amazing event and these amazing artists, he said. Underbelly, which is one of the biggest venues, said that book ticket sales were up 27% on 2019, while Laughing Horse said a big surge of ticket sales on the day of performances was bringing levels of sales up to 2019. Assembly says it's running about 10% behind, but that the pace is picking up each day. And Greenside says it's about 4.6% down, but is expecting to surpass 2019. So, Richard, firstly, it's exciting for the Fringe to have returned properly, but Edinburgh, it's a small city, and there can be infrastructure issues. But at the same time, I think it's fair to say that the festivals combined mean a huge amount to the city, and is a big part of Edinburgh's identity. So, do you think that there are any changes needed in order to begin to recognise, as I say, Edinburgh is a small city, has some interesting geography, which makes it a little bit more difficult, but that also recognises how important the festivals are to the city and, for that matter, to Scotland?
Well, absolutely, and that was one of the sort of daily challenges I had when I was councillor. I was also festivals and events champion and convener for culture in the city of Edinburgh, and of course that means that you were actually in charge of about 43% of all of Scotland's cultural wealth. So it was quite a big deal and a real honour to have that position. And so I'm very familiar then with the £450 million which is generated to the local economy every year, because I'd have to stand up and express that at full council every year. But of course that comes at a cost, and it's a very imbalanced figures, because it's undoubtedly true that the venues, the operators, the restaurateurs and hoteliers do very well out of that. The vast majority of actual artists and performers are lucky to break even. The vast majority of them actually lose money. And the actual city infrastructure that simultaneously comes under huge pressure. And at a time when, since 2008, again, Maureen mentioned earlier that, has the country actually ever recovered from that recession? And that's a good point, because my entire time as convener for culture, because the cultural infrastructure doesn't have statutory protections in the same way that the education and health does. We were constantly having to make cuts in our budgets and be forced to sell off venues and everything else. And of course, you have the situation where you're trying to trumpet, on the one hand, Edinburgh as the world's festivals capital, but on the other hand, are having to make cuts which are just going to lead to its inevitable long-term decline if that continues. So it's a really tough balance. I mean, I'm delighted to see that the tourist tax has now finally been taken seriously on board, and it really should have happened an awful lot quicker under the SNP government, and the council of which I've been a member. But it really should have. You go to any country in the world, and certainly any of the great European capitals, and no one quibbles about paying their 50 euro cents, in addition to the hotel room, because people know it's being invested in the theatres, in the cultural venues, in the cultural landscape, and of course in cleanliness and in the environment. And it's crucial that we move on that in Scotland. We've got hundreds of thousands of wealthy visitors who would not bat an eyelid to be contributing towards that, and indeed expect to. That's the other thing. It's a sort of false argument. People coming here expect to pay that because they're used to paying it at home and consider it as something is important to do so. So we really must be moving forward on that. It will help the city. It will help bring our cultural venues up into the 21st century, where I can tell you from my own experience, a lot of them are not where they need to be. And it will also help keep the residents of Edinburgh on side, because they will see that all this money being generated is being reinvested in their city to keep it the glorious city that it is. So there is a number of issues. first of all, we need to be celebrating the fact that the Fringe is on once again, and the festival in full is on, because of course the International Festival also opened on Friday night with a huge free event at Murrayfield Stadium, and last night there was performances from the Ukraine Freedom Orchestra in the Usher Hall, which is a really moving event because it was orchestral musicians from across Ukraine who gathered in Scotland and were given a rousing audience or reception, as you can expect from a Scottish audience. So, you know, this is a real jewel in Edinburgh's crown. There's no question about it. You can go anywhere in the world and people know Edinburgh festivals. It's very much in the absence of, as some put it very specifically, I think it was Alex Salmond who said, prior to the Scottish Parliament, the Edinburgh Festival was Scotland's ambassador internationally since the Second World War. So we should be making sure we're investing in that. Of course, we have huge conflicting priorities. I know that as a councillor, Maureen knows that in the Parliament. But, you know, once you lose your cultural infrastructure, you never get it back. You know, there won't be a rainy day where you suddenly have 60 million sitting around you can spend on a theatre. You know, we need to make sure we look after these jewels. They are the things that are bringing people to the country. They are putting us on the map. They are the soft power, which is crucial for any nation, and particularly small nations, to exert its influence across the world. And we must continue to focus on that. And we need to do more in terms of the tourist tax and bringing these sorts of finance to our festivals online.
Thanks, Richard. That was a fantastic manifesto you set out there. Thank you. It's covered all the and nothing that could be disagreed with, I think, by anyone who values the festivals and at the same time values Edinburgh and the contribution that the festivals make to Edinburgh's culture, Scotland's culture, and the culture of the world. Because, Maureen, I was going to ask you very quickly, in times of war in Europe, should we be doing more to promote and grow events like the Edinburgh festivals, which were, after all, established in the aftermath of the Second World War and were established to spread messages of peace and understanding?
Absolutely. And, you know, I'm really pleased, as Richard is, that the festival is back and looks like being record breaking again. And I agree with him on the tax, but we need to get it absolutely right and make sure that it's not just hotels, but it's guest houses and particularly Airbnbs that are paying the tax as well. So I think we should make sure that we get it right rather than rush it. But yes, it does promote, internationalism, and I hope that artists are not being held at borders because they can't get visas to come in and perform.
Thank you, Maureen. That's some very good, well-made points there as well. Thank you. But I'm afraid to say that is all that we have time for this afternoon. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes. If you would like to support us, then please subscribe or donate to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you'd like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot and on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland there. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us again then. And I hope that you've enjoyed a tasty full Scottish this afternoon. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's been watching, and a very special thanks to our very special guests, Maureen Watt and Richard Lewis. Thanks, guys.
Thanks very much.
And just a reminder, this August, Richard is producing and performing his cabaret-style one-man celebration on the Festival Fringe. The Hamlet After Party is on at the Lower Hall in the St. Stephen's Theatre. I'm also reminded that on this day in 1548, the 5-year-old Mary Queen of Scots set sail for France to escape Henry VIII's English troops. I won't be setting sail for anyone today, but if you're afloat, I hope that you enjoy fair winds. I hope that everyone enjoys a peaceful Sunday and can join us again here on Broadcasting Scotland very soon. Bye-bye.